Vezra Lorne sat on the cold pavement, blood smeared across her arms, her wide eyes filled with terror as the flashing red and blue lights illuminated her face. Just inside the house, Orlin Duvall lay unconscious, his body unresponsive, his pulse barely detectable. To the police, it looked like a brutal home invasion gone wrong, an innocent woman left battered and a man on the brink of death. But what no one realized yet was that the real danger wasn't the mysterious attacker Vezra claimed had broken in. The real danger was Vezra herself. Orlin Duvall had always been the type of man who followed a strict routine. He valued structure and control, which had made him successful in business and in life. For years, he had been in a committed relationship with Vezra Lorne, a woman who had once seemed like the perfect match for him. She was charming, intelligent, and deeply invested in their relationship, perhaps too invested. Over time, her behavior became more possessive, her emotions more erratic. Small disagreements turned into dramatic fights, and she often accused him of not loving her enough. Orlin tried to make it work, but eventually it became clear that their relationship was beyond repair. When he finally ended things, Vezra did not take it well. She pleaded, begged, and even threatened to harm herself, but Orlin stood firm. A few months later, he found solace in a new relationship with Lyrian Voss, a woman whose calm and steady nature was the complete opposite of Vezra's unpredictability. Things were going well between them, and Orlin finally felt like he could move forward. His business was thriving, his social life was balanced, and he was finally free from the exhausting turmoil he had endured with Vezra. He had no idea that she had never truly let him go. On a cold evening, neighbors in Orlin's upscale neighborhood heard a commotion coming from his home. Some dismissed it as a domestic argument, but the noise soon stopped, and the street returned to its usual silence. No one thought much of it, until the next morning when Orlin's cleaning service arrived and found the front door slightly ajar. Hesitant, the housekeeper stepped inside, calling out his name. There was no answer. She moved cautiously through the house until she found him sprawled on the living room floor, barely breathing, his skin pale, his body unnaturally still. Panic set in as she grabbed her phone and dialed emergency services. When paramedics arrived, they confirmed that Orlin was still alive, but in critical condition. He was rushed to the hospital, leaving behind a scene that puzzled investigators. The house showed no signs of forced entry, and there were no clear indications of a struggle. No broken furniture, no shattered glass, nothing to suggest an obvious break-in. Yet, there was something deeply unsettling about the entire situation. The mystery only deepened when authorities discovered Vezra Lorne at the scene. She was standing outside, trembling, wearing a dress stained with blood. Her hair was disheveled, her face streaked with tears. She claimed she had barely escaped with her life after being attacked inside the house. According to her, a masked intruder had broken in, assaulted her, and then turned on Orlin. She had managed to flee, but not before witnessing the brutal attack unfold. Her presence raised immediate questions. What was she doing at Orlin's house so late at night? Why had she returned to a man who had moved on with someone else? The officers who first responded to the scene noted how she seemed both panicked and oddly composed at the same time, as if rehearsing a story rather than recalling a traumatic event. News of Orlin's attack spread quickly, and speculation ran wild. Some believed Vezra's version of events, convinced that she had been in the wrong place at the wrong time. Others weren't so sure. The police launched a full investigation, determined to find out the truth. The only certainty was that Orlin Duvall had been left for dead, and the only witness was the woman who had once loved him more than anything. Whether she was truly a victim or something far more sinister remained to be seen. Vezra Lorne sat in the hospital waiting area, wrapped in a blanket, her hands still trembling. Nurses and doctors moved past her, focused on their patients, but she remained still, staring at the floor. She had given her statement to the police, recounting the terrifying moment she had been attacked in Orlin's house. According to her, she had gone there to talk, hoping for closure. But before she could say much, a masked intruder burst in. The figure had grabbed her, striking her across the face, before turning his attention to Orlin. She claimed she had fought back, but was no match for the intruder's strength. She barely escaped, running through the house, blood staining her dress as she stumbled onto the front lawn. By the time she managed to call for help, Orlin was already unconscious. At first glance, her story seemed believable. There were bruises on her arms and a cut on her forehead, evidence that she had been in some kind of struggle. But the more investigators looked into her claims, the more inconsistencies they found. Her injuries, while visible, were oddly placed. Too symmetrical, too controlled. They didn't resemble the chaotic wounds of someone who had barely survived an attack. Medical examiners noted that the bruises appeared to have been inflicted at different times, some fresher than others. It was as if she had been injured in stages rather than all at once. The security footage from Orlin's house raised even more doubts. The cameras outside showed no sign of forced entry. No unknown individuals had approached the house that night. The only person seen entering the property was Vezra herself. She arrived alone, carrying a small bag, and never left until after the police arrived. There was no masked intruder, no sign of an escape. If someone had attacked them, how had they entered without being seen? How had they left? The lead detective on the case, Roland Miles, began pressing Vezra with more pointed questions. If she had been attacked, why hadn't she called the police immediately? Why had she been found outside instead of seeking shelter inside the house? The timeline she provided didn't add up. She claimed to have hidden in the bathroom for several minutes before escaping, but her phone records showed no attempted emergency calls during that time. A deeper look into her past made things even murkier. Orlin's friends described her as emotionally unstable, someone who had struggled with their breakup more than she let on. After their separation, she had been seen near his office multiple times, lingering outside without reason. Some of his colleagues recalled her sending him long, desperate messages at all hours of the night, often flipping between apologizing and blaming him for ruining her life. Despite all of this, Orlin had never reported her behavior. He had assumed she would eventually move on. Vezra's demeanor shifted as the investigation continued. The nervous, fragile woman who had appeared traumatized at the hospital now seemed composed and defensive. When asked to recount her version of events again, she became irritated, insisting that she had already told them everything. Her insistence only made detectives more suspicious. A person who had barely survived an attack should have been eager to help catch the perpetrator, not frustrated by further questioning. Despite the mounting doubts, there was still no concrete proof that she was lying. Orlin, the only other person who knew the truth, remained in a coma, unable to confirm or deny her story. But investigators weren't ready to let go. They knew something was off. The evidence at the crime scene didn't support Vezra's claims, and the more they dug, the more they began to suspect that she wasn't a victim at all. Instead, she might have been the mastermind behind everything. Investigators continued piecing together the puzzle, determined to uncover the truth behind what had happened to Orlin Duvall. Vezra Lorne remained at the center of their suspicions, but without definitive proof, they had no choice but to tread carefully. She had presented herself as a victim, someone who had barely escaped a violent attack, but the evidence against her continued to build. The inconsistencies in her story, the lack of forced entry, and the strange nature of her injuries all pointed to something far more calculated than a random home invasion. Forensic experts combed through every detail from the crime scene, and their findings were troubling. The bloodstains on Vezra's dress appeared smeared rather than naturally spattered, as if they had been placed there deliberately. A more in-depth examination of her wounds revealed something even more suspicious. Many of the bruises had a uniform pattern, inconsistent with the chaotic struggle she had described. The cut on her forehead, which she had claimed was from the intruder, was shallow and precise, not the kind of injury expected from a life-threatening assault. Investigators turned to Vezra's personal life for more insight, and what they found painted a picture of a woman who was far more manipulative than she appeared. She had a history of unstable relationships, with former partners describing her as obsessive and controlling. In one case, she had fabricated a pregnancy to keep an ex-boyfriend from leaving her. In another, she had faked an illness to gain sympathy. These past incidents showed a pattern of deception, one that made her claims about the attack on Orlin even more questionable. As detectives dug deeper, they uncovered something even more disturbing. Vezra had taken out a secret life insurance policy on Orlin months before their breakup. The policy, worth a significant sum of money, had listed her as the sole beneficiary. Orlin had no knowledge of this, and there was no logical reason for Vezra to be involved in such a policy, especially after their separation. It suggested premeditation, a plan that had been set in motion long before the attack. Her financial records only added to the suspicion. In the weeks leading up to the incident, Vezra had withdrawn large sums of money and made several untraceable cash purchases. Investigators suspected that she had been preparing for something, though they still lacked concrete proof of her direct involvement in Orlin's condition. The breakthrough came when detectives recovered deleted messages from her phone. Vezra had been in contact with a man named Orlin Duvall, a known con artist with a history of fraud and extortion. Their conversations were cryptic, but suggested a level of planning that could not be ignored. References to timing things right, making sure no loose ends remain, and getting what's owed hinted at something far more sinister than a random attack. Another detail stood out in the recovered messages: mentions of a substance that could do the job quietly. Toxicology reports from Orlin's blood work revealed traces of an uncommon sedative, one that could cause temporary paralysis in large doses. It became clear that Orlin had not simply been attacked, but had been drugged. This explained why there were no signs of a struggle and why he had been found in such a vulnerable state. With mounting evidence, detectives started to see the bigger picture. Vezra had likely staged the entire crime, pretending to be a victim to cover her tracks. She had inflicted her own injuries, fabricated the story of an intruder, and had been waiting for Orlin to die so she could collect on the life insurance payout. But she had made a critical mistake. Orlin had survived, and now, as he remained in a coma, investigators were closer than ever to exposing the truth. As the investigation continued, the pieces of Vezra Lorne's deception became more apparent. What initially seemed like a brutal home invasion was now unraveling into something far more sinister: a calculated attempt to eliminate Orlin Duvall, while portraying herself as an innocent survivor. The newly recovered messages between Vezra and Duvall painted a chilling picture, but detectives still needed undeniable proof that she had orchestrated the attack. With Orlin still in a coma, authorities had no first-hand account of what had truly happened that night. They knew Vezra had been inside his home, but the lack of forced entry suggested she had either been let in willingly or had used a key. That raised another question: how had she gained access? A search of her belongings provided the answer. In a small compartment in her car, officers found a copy of Orlin's house key. He had changed the locks after their breakup, which meant Vezra had gone out of her way to obtain a new copy, likely without his knowledge. As detectives confronted Vezra with this discovery, her carefully constructed demeanor began to crack. She insisted she had found the key in Orlin's belongings when they were still together and had simply forgotten to return it. But the explanation didn't hold up. Orlin had been meticulous about security, and there was no logical reason he would have left an old key lying around. The more she spoke, the more her nervous energy betrayed her. Investigators could see the pressure building, but she wasn't ready to break just yet. Determined to strengthen their case, detectives turned their attention to Orlin Duvall, a known manipulator. He had a history of assisting people in executing fraudulent schemes in exchange for a cut of the profits. His involvement in Vezra's plot was still unclear, but financial records showed that she had transferred money to an account linked to him shortly before the attack on Orlin. It wasn't enough to charge her with conspiracy just yet, but it was another sign that she hadn't acted alone. Surveillance footage from a nearby convenience store provided another crucial lead. The night before the attack, Vezra had been caught on camera purchasing a set of gloves. a bottle of industrial-strength cleaning solution, and a disposable phone. Investigators found the timing suspicious. If she had truly been an innocent victim, why would she have been preparing for something in such a secretive manner? More importantly, where was the disposable phone now? The breakthrough came when they traced her movements after the attack. Cell tower records showed that, after leaving Orlin's house, she had driven to an isolated area outside the city, where she had remained for nearly 20 minutes before returning home. Suspecting she had disposed of evidence, a search team was deployed to comb through the area. It didn't take long before they found what they were looking for: half-burned pieces of fabric that matched the dress she had been wearing on the night of the incident. Nearby, buried under loose dirt, was the disposable phone. Forensic experts were able to retrieve fragments of messages from the device. The exchanges between Vezra and Drayson became even more damning. She had messaged him shortly after the attack, stating that it's done and that she needed everything gone before morning. This was the final piece of the puzzle. Vezra hadn't been the victim. She had been the mastermind. The case against her was now overwhelming. The staged injuries, the planted evidence, the financial transactions, and the attempt to destroy critical proof all pointed to one thing. She had planned Orlin's death down to the smallest detail. But there was one factor she hadn't accounted for: he was still alive, and soon he would be awake. Orlin Duvall's condition had remained unchanged for weeks. His doctors were cautious with their predictions, uncertain if or when he would wake up. But for investigators, time was running out. They had built a strong case against Vezra Lorne, proving that she had staged the attack to cover up her attempt to kill Orlin. However, without his testimony, the final piece of undeniable evidence remained just out of reach. They needed him to wake up. Vezra, on the other hand, continued to play the role of the wronged woman. She made public statements about her trauma, giving interviews where she tearfully recounted the terrifying night she had barely survived. To the outside world, she was a victim, a woman caught in a nightmare she hadn't asked for. But behind closed doors, investigators knew the truth. Every time they confronted her with inconsistencies in her story, she found new ways to deflect, shifting blame, acting outraged, and portraying herself as the target of an unfair investigation. Despite her act, authorities moved forward with their case. The recovered disposable phone, the life insurance policy, the staged injuries, and her secret payments to Drayson Ryan were enough to issue a warrant for her arrest. But before they could take her into custody, something unexpected happened. Orlin woke up. Weak and disoriented, Orlin struggled to piece together what had happened to him. His memory was foggy, but as he regained strength, the details started returning. He remembered Vezra arriving at his house, claiming she wanted to talk. He recalled feeling dizzy, his body growing heavy as if something was wrong. The next thing, he knew he was on the floor, unable to move. He could hear Vezra speaking, her voice sharp, but he couldn't respond. The realization hit him. He hadn't been attacked by a masked intruder. He had been drugged. When detectives spoke to him, Orlin confirmed their suspicions. Vezra had entered his home under false pretenses, likely slipping the sedative into his drink before staging the scene. As he lost consciousness, she must have inflicted injuries on herself to make it appear as though she had been attacked. Then, she waited, ensuring he was completely incapacitated before making her next move. She had wanted him to die, either from the drug's effects or from whatever additional harm she had planned to inflict. But something had gone wrong. Perhaps she panicked. Perhaps she realized someone would find out too soon. Either way, she had called the police before she could finish what she had started, hoping to control the narrative before anyone questioned her. With Orlin's testimony, the case against Vezra was sealed. She was arrested at her apartment, taken into custody before she could make another move. Gone was the composed, grieving ex-girlfriend. When confronted with the truth, she lashed out, screaming that Orlin was lying, that the police were twisting things against her. But the evidence was undeniable. The money transfers, the staged crime scene, the messages with Drayson, And now, Orlin's own words, there was no escape. As her trial approached, more details emerged. Drayton Rhine, seeking a reduced sentence, testified against her, admitting that she had hired him to help dispose of evidence and cover her tracks. He revealed that Vezra had been obsessed with controlling Orlin's life, unable to accept that he had moved on without her. The life insurance policy had been the final piece of her plan. If she couldn't have him, she would ensure she gained something from his death. Vezra was found guilty of attempted murder, fraud, and conspiracy. As she was led out of the courtroom, her once sympathetic supporters turned against her, realizing they had been deceived. The woman who had played the victim so well had finally been unmasked as the true villain. But despite her carefully crafted plan, she had made one fatal mistake. She had underestimated Orlin Duvall's will to survive.